Welcome to Leadership and Life Chat with your hosts, me, James Lay.
And me, Mark Curtis. In each episode, we'll be illustrating how success in leadership is inextricably linked with success in life.
Whether it's leadership in business, society, family or friends, we're all leaders.
Using our experiences and a range of expert guests, we'll share secrets to boosting your health, wealth and self.
So let's get on with the show.
Today, we're joined by coach, trainer and author Jamie Dixon. The reason we're so excited to have Jamie on the show is not the fact that he's worked with 160 multinational companies over the last 10 years, or even the fact that Jamie has authored 3 fantastic books. It's the fact that Jamie, having spent his educational years in the UK, made the bold decision to move to China, where he's lived for the last 15 years. The profound impact of the Chinese culture has heavily influenced Jamie's thinking and how he delivers to his clients, specifically pragmatism, practicality, and philosophy. So, Jamie Dixon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be with you on
Welcome,
this
Jamie.
on this globally hot day.
It is a globally hot day today, and it's lovely to see that for those that are watching on YouTube that you're wearing Norwich City colours. You're gone with the theme anyway, with a yellow T-shirt and a green background. So presumably you're a Norwich City fan.
Technically a Manchester United fan, actually, although I'm quite embarrassed to admit that these days after last season. Although technically the colours I think work for Manchester United as well. So
they do, yeah, gold and green, and I can't talk about my team because they finished bottom last season, so it can't be quite as bad as that. Although you could be Australian, I suppose, with very similar colours. But
and James, let's be honest, on a global scale, most people listening won't even know who Norwich City are. So
very big in China, almost as big as Manchester United, I'm sure.
Says Mark as an Ipswich Town fan. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay, we'll move on quickly from that one. So Jamie, it's great to have you on the show, and for those listening, Jamie's joined us from Shanghai this morning. So welcome from Shanghai. Thank you for coming in, Jamie. So just to kind of whet the listeners' appetite a little bit, would you like to maybe expand on your story and your journey, just to give it a bit of background about yourself?
Sure. So about 15, 16, 17 years ago, something like that, I graduated from university and I was working in a coffee shop, which is not really where you want to be after you've graduated from university. And things weren't really going very well for me at the time. And one day I had an argument with my girlfriend at the time, and I just got really frustrated and thought, to hell with it, I'm leaving the country. And at the time, the easiest way of leaving the country was to go abroad and teach English. And so I submitted my CV to a teaching English website, and the next morning I had job offers from all over the world, like Costa Rica, Japan, Korea, Mexico, France, Japan. Just mentioned Japan and China as well. And after I submitted my CV, I thought I'm probably overreacting here. I'm sure I can find my feet in the UK, but when I got these job offers, I just thought they were too good to turn down.
And you made it up with your girlfriend at this point, or?
I had a conversation with my girlfriend and said, bye-bye, I'm out of here. So we agreed to end that relationship. Yeah. And it all happened in such a rush. I settled on China because at the time everyone was saying China is the future of the world, which turned out to be kind of true. And Mandarin will be a really useful language. So I thought I may as well go to China. And the job offer I had in China said, can you be here in 3 weeks' time? Which was a mad rush. And if I'm the kind of person who likes to think a lot before I act. But because
Did you speak Mandarin?
I did not speak Mandarin before I went. Okay. And so several weeks later I turned up in China, and I did not speak a word of Mandarin. And I had to learn whilst I was there, and I actually discovered I was really good at learning languages. I came out of the education system feeling I was pretty dumb, to be honest. And when I got to China, I was really determined to learn Mandarin. So I spent a lot of time in my bedroom with a Chinese textbook, learning phrases like how to ask what the time was. And as soon as I felt I could remember those phrases, I'd go out on the street and I'd just ask stranger after stranger after stranger. And I remember I once spent about 2 hours walking up and down a street asking people what the time was. And turns out you learn really, really quickly that way. So I spent a year teaching English and learning the language. And, I got to a fairly good conversational level and decided, I think my future is here. So I tied off some loose ends in the UK and I came back to China, and I leveraged my Mandarin skills to get into corporate. And there was a job at Amway China. Amway's a bit like Avon in the UK. And at the time, Amway China was Amway's biggest market. And they had something like 100,000 new salespeople each month. But the government wasn't such a huge fan of their business model because it had created some social problems in the past. And so the government said, you can operate here on the condition that you give these salespeople training. And Amway said, sure. And they invested a lot of money into training, and they created a massive pool of training resources in China. And they had all of these training resources in China, but the affiliates in Southeast Asia quite nearby were quite jealous. They didn't have anything. So they wanted someone who could speak English, could speak Mandarin, had some classroom experience, and could act as this bridge between China and Southeast Asia to share China's training resources. And that was my introduction into the world of leadership development. And I just fell in love with it instantly. And I did that job for a few years. A few years later, I moved out. I worked for a training company. And after a few years of that, I set up my own company. And now I work with a lot of leaders, especially Chinese leaders in multinational companies who are really struggling to influence their stakeholders due to a lot of cultural issues. But right now, in the last 2 years in particular, there's been a lot of challenges with the story that people have about China. And, it's not a good story right now that people are telling about China. And some of that story is true. Some of that story is not true. Some of it is somewhat true. But it's a big barrier to getting their foreign leaders to invest more into the China market and to adapt to the China market and so on. So I work with a lot of Chinese leaders, helping them bridge that gap at the moment.
It's a fascinating story. And I like the bit you mentioned right at the early stages there when you're in China in terms of learning the language, actually getting out there. And so I think some of the barrier around learning a new language is people's reluctance to make a little bit of a fool of themselves and having the courage to just speak that other language and not be understood, not be able to understand the response that comes back, etc. But that sort of trial and error that sort of that you went through, I'm sure accelerated your development of the language. Did you speak languages at school?
No, I learned
apart from English.
Yeah, well, just about English. I learned French and Spanish, and I wasn't very good at them at all. Mandarin was really surprisingly easy for me. And everyone says Chinese is a really difficult language. Actually, it's really not. The grammar is so simple. It's so logical. The most difficult thing is the tones. There's like 4 different tones, which really confuses people. But when you focus on trying to use the right tone, you sound really robotic. When you focus instead on copying how other people say it, that's how you get it to be really natural. And what you were saying about making a fool of yourself, I have done that so many times. In fact, when I was working for Amway, my Chinese was conversational. It was fairly fluent, but it wasn't perfect. And it's a little bit like, it was a little bit like a 6-year-old's language level. If you speak to a 6-year-old, their level of English, that was my level of Chinese. And it meant that people treated me a bit like a child as well, because when I expressed myself, I didn't sound so mature. And it was pretty painful. But you learn a lot from those experiences. And it's really only when you expose yourself with that level of vulnerability that you can grow and you can make progress.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's an impressive skill set. And
a question, Jamie. After you've been going around asking people the time, did your neighbours present you with a watch? Do they think this poor English guy clearly doesn't have a watch?
Yeah, in fact, I remember I used to go to a lot of bars at that time, and I didn't drink alcohol. I don't drink alcohol at all. I just drank Coca-Cola. But I'd just be speaking with the barmaids, and I just have the same conversations over and over again. Because
what time is it?
Yeah, what time is it? I went
time you went home,
today.
Jamie.
Yeah, the ham I ate was interesting.
But it's really interesting when you talk about making a fool, isn't it? I tried to learn a bit of Italian before we went on holiday several years ago to Italy, and I went into a butcher's. We were in self catering accommodation, and I think I ended up accidentally asking for minced dog instead of minced meat. So they kind of gave me a funny look to start with, and then they laughed, and then they helped me correct it. They didn't. It was amusing for all involved, but they actually wanted to help in the end. I think that was the biggest thing. It's a bit like when you're best man speech, and everyone says no one wants you to fail. I think it's for the majority of the time, it's like that when you try and learn something as well, isn't it? People don't want to see you fail; they want to help you get it right and get better at it.
A few years ago, I was in Bangkok delivering a training to a group of leaders over there, a group of Thai leaders. And when I deliver trainings, I like to draw pictures and I like to hang them up on the wall. But on this day, the walls were really full. And so I thought, I'm a creative guy. I'll just put the pictures on the floor. And so for the whole morning, I had the pictures on the floor and I was pointing to them with my foot. And at lunchtime, someone came up to me and said, "Can I tell you something about Thai culture? It's really, really, really rude to point with your foot. It's a lot like giving the middle finger to someone and doing that for the whole morning." And it was a massive error on my part. But when I came back after lunch, I apologized to them and they said, "Mai ban rai," and just let it go. And, just like you said, no one wants you to fail. They want you to succeed. And most people are quite understanding when you make mistakes. Thai people in particular.
So in our culture, that would be the equivalent of somebody putting their middle finger up to the audience every other minute through the course of the morning. Yeah, I can imagine that going down well. So, yeah. So it's one thing being conversationally fluent or sufficiently fluent, but you've got the written side of it, and then to immerse yourself in work must have been a huge challenge, I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, when you immerse yourself in the work aspect in another culture, you encounter cultural differences. And a lot of cultural differences that I had to adapt to and overcome and learn about, and a lot of frustrating and embarrassing experiences along the way, and if I just think of a personal example, not so much a work-related example, but I remember my first 4 years in China, I was just a really angry person because I was just expecting everyone to behave the way British people behave. And I was just really stupid. I didn't realize, I'm in a foreign culture and they don't operate by British rules and they shouldn't operate by British rules. And one day I was on the subway and an old lady barged me out of the way. Shanghainese old ladies are surprisingly strong, actually. And it was when I was having a really, really bad day. And it just kind of pushed me over the edge. And I responded by shoulder barging her back. and in that moment, I thought, oh, God, Jamie, sweet little boy from mid-Sussex, has just shoulder barged an old lady on the subway. I thought, okay, I've probably taken this a bit too far. And so I turned around to apologize to her. But as I went to apologize to her, I noticed that her face just hadn't registered anything. Like I hadn't done anything. And I realized in that moment that to her, that behavior was just, it's not offensive or aggressive behavior. It's just another way of asking someone to get out of the way. And so I've had a lot of moments like that where suddenly I realized the way I was thinking about a situation was just completely irrelevant.
It's interesting, Jamie. I think sometimes when the likes of Mark and I go down to London, for instance, the Big Smoke, it feels a bit like a Crocodile Dundee, where we're sort of saying hello to anybody that we walk past, because it's a different culture, it's a different environment, different expectations in those situations than the rural setting that we're a bit more used to, particularly Mark in North Norfolk. So for the listeners, I've not been to China. So what are there some key things that spring to mind in terms of differences between China and perhaps UK culture that you can share with the listeners?
So one of the biggest things is the way people communicate over here. They, in Chinese they call it 含蓄, which means very subtle and indirect, and a lot of the time through hints. So for example, I remember one American manager that I was training in Macau. He hadn't been in China for very long, and he was sharing, the other day, my Chinese my Chinese team member, she came up to me in the office and she said, "Your way of managing is very different." And she just left it at that. And he couldn't figure out what she meant. And that's what we mean by 含蓄, by very subtle. They drop a hint, and the meaning is not so much communicated through what they say, it's communicated through how they say it. And so they have this this habit of when they receive a message, they're always thinking, what do they really mean by that? Because that's how they communicate. They give a bit of information and leave room for you to guess the meaning. Because especially in sensitive situations, if you're too direct, it's quite impolite. So I remember I once sent an email to a Chinese client, and I was about to book my plane ticket. So I sent an email to them and I said, "Hi, I just want to double check the training date. Is it still according to the original schedule? Because I need to book my plane tickets." Now, to you and I, when I send that message, my meaning, hopefully, is pretty clear. I want to double check because I'm about to book my plane ticket. But when this went to the Chinese HR lady that I was sending it to, she used this thinking habit of, what does he really mean by that? What does he really mean by want to double check the training date? And what does he really mean by because I want to book my plane ticket? Why would he say that? And so I got this reply saying, "I'm so sorry, but because we booked the date, we can't change the dates. And for the plane ticket, we need you to buy the plane ticket, and then we will reimburse afterwards. This is our company policy." And so it was a very confusing response to get. But this is the kind of communication issue that you can have when you're communicating with Chinese people, especially Chinese co-workers. They don't say things directly. They kind of leave some room for you to guess what they really mean. And so that's something that confuses a lot of people when they come over here.
Wow.
And you can really see how, UK, Western businesses who want to interact and deal with Chinese businesses as well, without knowing this kind of stuff. We've talked a lot, James and I, on previous podcasts, and we did one on Mind Your Language. The words are only words. It's the meaning, it's the unsaid things which very often cause the confusion in communication. And it sounds like the West communicating with the East almost, that there's an extra gulf, an extra bridge you've got to go over to be able to effectively communicate as well.
Yeah. They call it high context communication. In the West, we use a very low context approach where all of our meaning is contained in our words. and we are incredibly specific. Our languages are just incredibly specific. I mean, if you German, I think, is an even more specific language than English. If you translate an English book into German, I think it's about a third longer. But English is already a much more specific language than Chinese. And this is a big challenge for a lot of Chinese people when they're learning English, because their thinking habits are just not used to thinking in that level of specificity. I can't pronounce that word, but specificity. They're not used to thinking in that level of that word. So they really, really struggle to learn English. And I'm actually always really impressed with Chinese people who speak English, because there's a lot of Chinese people who speak outstanding English. And there's a lot of Westerners from all sorts of countries who live in China who don't speak Chinese. And so the amount of effort they have had to go to learn to speak our language is just incredible what they've done. I think it's a really big achievement for them.
Do you find that when you're communicating, if obviously they will spot that you'll probably spot you're English or British, do they use that as an opportunity to roll out their English on you? I know often happens if you're learning, say, Spanish, and you go to Spain often, you don't need to speak Spanish a lot of the time, partly because they're actually volunteering to speak English. They're trying to improve their own English. And so you end up with us trying to speak Spanish and them trying to speak English. Do you get the similar thing in China? How common is the English language over there?
Actually, in a city like Shanghai, because Shanghai is a very international city, a lot of people speak English. And there's a lot of people who, their English level is already up there. They don't need to practice. So they're happy to speak whatever language you want to speak with them. But then there's some people who really, really, really want to practice. And so like I'll go into a restaurant and I'll order in Chinese and they'll speak to me in English. And then we get really confused about which language are we supposed to use right now. So that can happen as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think the really interesting point I'm taking out, and the listeners, international trade is huge now, whether you're a small business, a medium or a large business. It touches on virtually all businesses now. And I think there's always been a thing in the UK, which is, I think the schools teach Mandarin now. So English children are starting to learn Mandarin. I don't have children, so I don't know. But one of the interesting things from what you said there is it's as China becomes more influential on the world stage, which it will continue to do over the next decade or two, it's really important that the West starts to understand not just the language of Mandarin, but the culture, as you were talking about, and the cultural differences in the communication. I think if we don't teach that as well, then we're only doing half the job. I think it's really important for any businesses out there to make sure they embrace the cultural impact of the language as well as trying to learn the language.
I completely agree, because the culture is even harder to adapt to than the language, I would argue. And it's way more important for doing business. And I give an example. A number of years ago, I went to Beijing to meet a client, and we were talking about a presentation skills training that I was going to deliver for their team. And presentation skills training is normally quite straightforward. Most of my conversations with clients about that topic don't take very long, maybe 45 minutes, and we agree on the dates, the topic's done. But this client, it took 3 hours to talk with them about it. And they were just going back and forth about all of the details and challenging me on everything. And it was clear they didn't trust me at all. And I was really surprised at the end of the discussion that, they agreed to sign the contract and we'll do the training. So I went and did the training. It was fine. A few months later, I was in Beijing, and, she'd seen my social media, and she said, "Oh, I see you're in Beijing. Are you free for a meeting about another training?" And I thought, oh God, I better clear another half a day from my schedule tomorrow. So I went there and we sat down, and she said, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "How are you?" "Fine." "Good. So I have this training. It's this date. Are you available? Can you do this training?" Like, yeah. all right, done. And in 5 minutes, the conversation was over. And I learned an important lesson about trust in that instance. Trust takes a lot of time to build in China. In the West, if you think of trust as being like points on a scale from 0, no trust, to 100, in the West, whenever you start a business partnership, you start at quite a high level of trust, maybe 70, 80, maybe even 100 points. In China, you pretty much start from 0 and you have to build it up. And you build it up through, through proving your competence, but also through investing in personal relationships. And I have to say, this is something I don't so much like about Chinese culture, because it takes so long to build trust in business. You find a lot of traditional Chinese businesses, their entire business strategy is just trust and relationships. And in fact, one of my neighbors, he works for a property development company. He's very well connected to the CEO of this property development company, and he's the HR director. And on the side, he set up a recruitment business, which is the number one recruitment supplier to the business he works for. Conflict of interest.
Yeah,
just a bit. But, no one really bats an eyelid about it because, he has this good relationship with the company and the CEO. And so it's all okay. But I see a lot of Chinese businesses, especially the smaller ones, run by more traditional Chinese people. They pretty much just operate based on that principle. I know this person, I have a relationship with them. There's this opportunity, let's just do something. And it's not really strategy, it's just trust.
You see, that's really interesting, Jamie, because I sort of think back to my dad was a bank manager, and it was probably a slightly different time, and he was a bank manager lending money, as they do, but at a different time when it was very much trust orientated. Perhaps it's things have changed quite a lot since he retired. But it was very much, there was the concept of a local bank manager who knew and trusted certain, people around the market town or whatever, and he could make decisions based on that, and largely it worked. And I think the banking world, like many other industries, has changed a little bit since those times, and there's still trust and there's still room for maneuver and decision making by bank managers, I'm sure, but not quite to the level there was 30, 40 years ago. So there seems like some sort of parallel between what the license he was given at that point and the emphasis on trust, and having built relationships, having lent money to perhaps an individual in the past, being willing to do that again once that trust has been formed. So,
and I was talking to a client once, Jamie, and he was saying that this is going back a few years now. They were working with a Chinese supplier, and it reminded me when you were talking about that trust story. They went over to China, they met, they agreed what they were going to do, and my client said, do we need to sign something here to make sure it's all in writing before we head back to the UK? And sort of paraphrasing it, the Chinese supplier said, no, we've agreed this. We've shaken hands on it. Almost my word is my bond. You go back to the UK now, and we'll deliver the goods within 4 weeks, and we'll sign the contract at a later date. It was very much on a trust basis, and the goods. My client went back thinking, "Well, this is all a bit dodgy. Is it actually going to happen?" And it did happen. That the goods arrived when they said they were going to. No problem at all. Paperwork came through, all got signed off officially. So that, as you say, that is very different to. Whilst in the UK we do start with a high level of trust, from a business point of view, I don't think many people would do business with each other nowadays without a level of commitment in writing. It just wouldn't happen as much, would it? So so you've got different levels of trust within perhaps different parts of the of the economy almost as well.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, I was just thinking, I work with some, on a freelance basis with some consulting companies. I work with some international ones based in Europe, the UK, the US, and I work with local ones as well, Chinese ones. The ones that have delayed paying me have never been the local ones, interestingly. Not all of my friends have had the same experience, but the local ones that I work with, they're normally extremely effective at paying me and getting things through. And the paperwork I have to do with them is, interestingly, not very much. But like recently, I've been working with one consulting company that's an American company, and the amount of paperwork and red tape that I've had to jump over just to get on their books has been unbelievable. So but at the same time, I have worked with a big Chinese corporation before who, I'd say they're borderline gangsters. the way they behave.
Don't name them.
I won't name them on here, but they have a bit of a bad reputation amongst some of the people I work with. The bigger companies in China can be quite difficult to work with. The smaller ones, you do have to be careful, but if you have a good relationship with them, they're generally quite good.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I think what we've learned so far, Jamie, is that there's some fantastic hints and tips for anyone who's wanting to do business with Chinese companies. So I think there's been some great value there already. We've talked so far a lot about, if you like, the differences culturally, but between maybe the West and the East. But some things within business are common languages. And one area I'd like to maybe explore with you, coming back to sort of, if you like, your skill set and what you do to work with businesses, is leaders set the tone, their behaviors, how they set the culture within a business is the heartbeat for the business. You've worked with some fantastic companies around the world. I'd just like to explore maybe some of the commonality of, if you like, self-sabotaging behaviors that you've seen within leaders, which then have knock-on effects into the culture and the performance of businesses, and what they are and what we should be looking out for.
One of the biggest self-sabotaging behaviors that I can think of is a lack of empathy, just not considering the other person's perspective. And I see this a lot, and it might just be because that's one of the main problems I deal with. So I get called in when it's an issue, but it really creates a lot of challenges. So it could be you get a lot of in big companies in particular, you get a lot of complexity, and you have a lot of people who need to work with other teams in other functions and ask them to do things. But because they have no authority over these people, they have no power to get them to do things. And so rather than investing time in developing relationships with these people and having a reasonable conversation, the only way they can think of is to just push and push and push and push and push and threaten and say, if you don't do this, our customer's going to leave us and it's going to be all your fault. And so I see that kind of behavior an awful lot. And there's several variations of this issue as well. And another way it comes out is in managers, especially people who have not managed a team before and now they're managing a team. They forget that you need to invest time in the personal relationship with your team members, and simple things such as asking people how they're doing and smiling and making small talk before meetings, they forget. And so they spend all of their time just talking about work. And so that damages trust. And once that trust erodes, it becomes really, really difficult to manage people. And another way it comes out is working across borders. And I see this both from the Chinese side, but also from the other side as well. is just no understanding of what's going on in their situation. And if I take an example, a European company that makes coffee machines, the Chinese team were desperate to sell the coffee machines on the local e-commerce platform called Tmall, because that's where all e-commerce happens. But the European side was saying, we have a website. If customers want to buy online, they can buy on our website. And they didn't realize that no one uses websites in China. They use apps. They don't use websites. And so they assumed they understood the situation in China, but they didn't. On the other end of the scale, in the midst of the pandemic, like this was around October 2020, was working with a Chinese team, and the HR director was complaining about how strict the pandemic restrictions were. They had to wear face masks in the office at all times, have their temperatures checked. They could only work in the office 2 weeks at a time and then 2 weeks at home. And so she complained to the US team, like, this is unnecessary. Things are normal in China. We don't need to do this. But she showed no empathy for the US team. She didn't realize that they didn't know what the situation was in China. And all of the news they were getting about China was negative. And their situation in the US, they had friends and colleagues and family members dying at the time. And so she had no empathy for their situation. So this lack of empathy shows up in so many different ways, and it creates a lot of problems. And it's typically the kind of problems I get called in to help people solve.
And I'm sure we'll come on to some other self-sabotaging behaviours, but just to then turn it on its head, what would your top tips be in terms of how people could improve their empathy?
Empathy is actually very, very simple. It's as simple as spending more time imagining being the other person and imagining, if they are saying and doing this right now, then what might have caused them to say and do that? What might have been influencing them? What might they be thinking? What might they be feeling? It's just thinking about those things. And it's not hard. It's actually really easy. And in the trainings and coaching sessions that I do, I take people through an exercise where I ask them, to think of one particular person and, okay, list some things this person is saying and doing about whatever issue you have. And, okay, now list some things that you think have influenced them. Okay, now list what you think they are thinking and feeling. And when I guide people through this exercise, they find it's really easy to think from the other person's perspective. So the actual act of empathy itself is not challenging. The challenge is dropping our own self-concern. And the time when we need empathy the most is the time when we are least capable of it. When we have a really, really pressing issue, something very urgent, it's giving us pressure, and we need a solution now, that is when we are 100% focused on our self-concern. And that is when we are most likely to push other people. But that is the time when we need to stop and think, what is their perspective on this? And how can I adapt my communication to better suit their perspective? So I think the little tip there is when you are, you have this resistance, this conflict or disagreement, that is a time to take a deep breath and spend a little bit more time thinking about their perspective. Ask a few more questions before you say what you want to say. Just simple habits like that. And boom, you can open up empathy. It's not as hard as people think.
That reminds me of the Stephen Covey 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and one of those principles being seek first to understand and then be understood. And I know in the past, Mark, we've talked about perceptual positions, and a good way of sort of almost dispute resolution. I've used this in the past in a work setting is when you've got perhaps two people that can't see eye to eye, is actually get them to write down their views, what's going through their heads, and then you invite them to to try and step into the shoes of the other individual and see what they see, and write down, again, writing it down is more powerful, is putting down the thoughts that are going through their heads, why they think the way they think. And then finally, a third position is to almost look at it impartially, so bringing the two aspects together and seeing where there's common ground and why, and that's worked really well. So very similar to what you're saying there, but just stepping into the shoes of the other person. I love the point as well. You're talking around investing in personal relationships with those around you, and that can be easily overlooked when we're really busy. We can forget those softer touches and underestimate the power they have. And we've talked in the past about building up sort of like almost goodwill accounts with people, so that actually occasionally you might need to draw down on that goodwill from time to time. But it sounds manipulative, I expect, but time well spent listening to other people and stepping into their world. And it reminded me of Alex Ferguson. We were talking about Manchester United at the beginning. One of the things that he used to do as a manager was he would make sure he knew everybody's name within the Manchester United setup, the names of the journalists and all those sorts of things. But he'd also go that one step further. He'd know the birthdays of the wives of the players and things like that, and ensure that they were sent flowers. And he would really go that one step further to invest his in his relationships, which built that trust and built that sort of common effort towards success.
And Jamie, a couple of points which really stood out for me there. Firstly, I was listening to another podcast where they were talking about cognitive dissonance, and they were saying that effectively you're always going to try and prove yourself right. So if you don't take that time, as you were saying, to put yourselves in the shoes of the other person, you're just going to end up head-to-head arguing about who's right, and that doesn't get anyone anywhere, or trying to prove the other person wrong and pushing them down effectively. So by stepping into those shoes, you're also bypassing, if you like, your cognitive dissonance. You're actually looking for a better resolution for everybody, which has got to be good for everybody. If you end up with a better solution for everybody, it's better than someone winning and someone losing. And finally, before I'll shut up because this is about you, not us.
Taking over here.
A great thing I heard the other week was Cadbury's. I don't know who they're owned by now, but the Cadbury's, the chocolate company in the West. They now have a standard agenda when they have one-to-one meetings, and there's only 3 things on the agenda. It's you, we, it. So the first thing you do is you talk about you, the person, how are they, what's going on in their lives. Then you talk about we, the business, and then finally it, the issue that you want to deal with in the business, and you build it that way to get the trust and the rapport going in the meeting every time. And I loved it. I thought, what simple way to approach every one-to-one meeting you have with somebody.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely powerful, because in a lot of the workshops I do on influencing, relationships are the grease for influence. And a lot of the time when people have challenges with influence, especially in big organizations, it's because all of a sudden they need this strange, distant team's help, and they've never invested any time in getting to know anyone on this team whatsoever. And now all of a sudden they need to ask them for a favor. And without the relationship, you can't do it. And so I give people a list of ways of connecting with people, and I ask them to think of habits that they can practice every single day to help them strengthen and expand their connections. And some of the habits are just so simple. One of them is when I'm at the coffee machine and someone comes up behind me, I will smile at them and say hello. And a lot of the time, if you're in a big company, this is especially an issue in a big company, because you work with hundreds, sometimes thousands of strangers. Even though they're your colleagues, they're strangers. And so a place like the coffee machine or the canteen is an opportunity to meet someone that 6 months from now, you might be requesting their help with something. And if you can invest a few seconds now just to smile at them and say, hello, that might lead to small talk, and that might lead to a relationship. It might not, but at least you tried. And another thing is, when I have a meeting, I will turn up 5 minutes early, because those 5 minutes before the meeting is when everyone is talking about football and their pets and the British weather. And that small talk is where you build relationships. So just spending a bit more time talking with people about people things, not work things, and boom, suddenly you have all of these relationships.
No, it's no different from when we started the interview episode today, is it? We've had, in fact, sometimes we do kick ourselves that we ought to hit record sometimes at the very outset, because there's some gems in the early exchanges when we're just sort of talking through how things are going. We've already covered a lot of that ground before we hit record, and it just puts everybody at ease, including ourselves. So that works really well, and it's no different from business meetings. You've obviously got to make sure it doesn't, I guess, again, respecting the cultures. Different cultures have different views in terms of meetings and the order in which you do things. Is it Germany where they like to get to the point early, and then they'll do all of the sort of more sociable aspect after the meeting or at the back end of the meeting? Different countries and different cultures have different orders in which you do things, but worth knowing that in advance.
I've noticed with the Americans that I've worked with, they tend to be straight to business, and not so much time invested in getting to know the people. Actually, I've noticed that with a lot of Americans that I've worked with. Interestingly enough, Chinese are actually quite interesting, because everyone knows the word guanxi, the Chinese word for relationships, and in China, relationships are everything. I'm quite surprised with the number of Chinese people I meet who are not very skilled at things like small talk and building relationships. I'm not quite sure what's happened there exactly. I guess it's something to do with the education, but I find a lot of Chinese people, even in big companies, they just don't really spend time getting to know people outside of their team. In fact, this is an interesting cultural concept. There are peach cultures and coconut cultures, and this might explain why the Chinese maybe don't spend so much time getting to know people outside of their team. In a peach culture, and you could argue Britain is a peach culture, we are nasty or direct, tough to the people we know in our inner circles, our family members, our friends. And we're soft and so polite to complete strangers. And we see this all the time you go to London and you accidentally walk into someone and you apologize, or they walk into you and you still apologize. And we leave the door open for a complete stranger, but we tell our kid off for going off into the road. That's a peach culture. China is a coconut culture, and it really blows people's minds. They're harsh to people on the outside, but on the inside, they are incredibly soft. And so if you come to China and you go on the subway, for example, you'll be shocked at what you see. Sometimes it's really uncivilized. There's a lot of pushing and shoving, and it's like a race to get a seat. And there are people pushing people out of the way just so they can get their seat. And it's really rude. But then if you take this exact same person and you are their friend or their family member, and you go out to dinner with them, they're incredibly polite. And it's because they treat their in-groups very, very differently to their out-groups. So peaches and coconuts.
I love the peaches and coconuts analogy, and I know I've spoken in the past with Russians, and they've shared a similar view. They have a bit of a reputation for perhaps being a little bit stern-looking on things like the tube, etc., in public. But once you break that down, once the people they know, they're polar opposites. So perhaps that's the way to be. Perhaps we ought to be at least treating strangers. If we're peach cultures, then we ought not to have that hard middle. For those around us, we should be treating the people we know and love.
We should just be
with the
jelly
same
cultures.
respect that we do people we don't know.
Perhaps we should be jelly cultures. We should we should be teaching. We should be treating everyone the same. We should be nice and polite to everybody.
Exactly.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So Jamie, one of the reasons we wanted to get you on the show is your new book, which came out a few weeks ago, which is called The Story Habit, and it kind of links storytelling to helping people change behaviours. So perhaps you'd like to talk to us a bit about your new book and what people will learn from that.
Yeah, so The Story Habit is, it's obviously about storytelling, and some of that is obviously about how to tell stories. But I think storytelling is a misunderstood subject. There's actually a lot more to storytelling than just telling stories. I think storytelling, its most relevant application to leaders in particular, is about shaping the stories that people believe in. And it could be that, the stories that your customers believe about your brand, could be the stories that your team members believe about your strategy and your vision, or it even could be the stories that candidates believe about your employer brand, and so on. And it turns out that when you look at how to tell a story, you can learn from how to tell a story exactly the things you need to do to shape the stories people believe in. And so I have a framework I talk about in the book called Relate, Challenge, Resolve. And the idea is that a story always starts with a character in a situation the audience can relate to. If they can't relate to it, then it has no impact on them. They can't understand it. They lose interest. So we get introduced, for example, in The Lion King, to Simba, who is he's a lion. I'm not a lion, but he's a child, and I used to be a child, and I know what it's like to have parents telling me what to do, and so we relate to them. And as the audience relate to the character, suddenly something happens, and they face a challenge. And in Simba's case, his father dies, and he has to go off into the jungle and live on his own. And then after they face the challenge, we want to see how they resolve the challenge. And in the end, Simba comes back, kills his uncle, and becomes king. And Relate, Challenge, Resolve works exactly the same for influencing people and shaping the stories people believe in. Because when we want to change people's minds, normally our natural reaction is to go straight to challenging people and say, you're wrong, I'm right, and this is why. But that doesn't work. What we need to do first is relate to people first. And we need to show that we understand their perspective, why they think that way, what they care about, what's important to them. And as we are relating, they'll be nodding their heads. And when we do enough relating, we can then move to gently prodding and challenging the current stories that they believe in. And if we do that well enough, we change their minds and we can change what they believe in. Now, changing people's minds is not enough to get them to take action. So that's where resolve comes in. That's where we give them an action plan, something, a next step that we want them to take. And so the Story Habit is all about this Relate, Challenge, Resolve framework. And it presents Relate, Challenge, Resolve as individual skills. And the easiest way to master a skill is to build simple habits that allow you to grow that skill naturally. And so I have a number of habits for Relate, Challenge, and Resolve. And that's why I call it the Story Habit.
The thing I love about that, Jamie, is it's such a simple model to have to follow as well. It's not overly complicated. You've got three simple things: relate, challenge, resolve. We can all remember that. And with the habits that you're introducing to people, over a period of time, this becomes second nature. This is how we do it as leaders. So some of the things we were talking around in terms of self-sabotaging behaviors earlier on empathy, this model is really going to help people build empathy as well, isn't it? Because it's really getting to the core of understanding as well.
Yeah, I mean, relate is all about empathy. It's all about learning their story and showing you understand their story. And I find when I share this with the leaders that I work with, the relate part is the most important takeaway for them. And it's the most fundamental skill for most people to master. Even myself, as someone who wrote this book and came up with this framework, it's still something I have to remind myself every so often to relate before challenging. It's not natural to do, but it's so effective when you do it. So it relates exactly to what I was talking about earlier with regards to empathy. Yeah.
And we're wired to.
Sorry, James. Go
on. And we're wired to respond and remember stories, aren't we? It's gone through the generations of storytelling. It's a fantastic way of communicating. And often, I've been to training days and things like that, and actually you come back. There might be lots of lists and bullet points and sort of pages and pages of material that you might come back with, but often it's the stories that you remember. And if the story can be structured in such a way that you learn something from it, then it's just a really powerful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a number of reasons why stories are so easy to remember. One is because they tend to present really vivid details, things that you can easily picture or hear or feel or taste in your mind. And facts and statistics tend not to be so vivid. So that's one reason it's quite easy to remember. And another reason is because a story is normally a journey. When we're relating to the character, we're really understanding what's important to them and what is normal to them. And we're kind of building both empathy and sympathy for this character. And the story builds us up to an emotional high, and then suddenly their father dies. And now we have this emotional shock. And that emotional shock as well is something that helps us remember, because emotion is like super glue for memory. So there's a lot of reasons stories work. And I call story the language of the mind, because it doesn't matter which culture you go to, storytelling is the language that everyone can understand. Even if you don't speak the same language, there's still a way of using storytelling to communicate effectively with other people. And I give the example, just now I mentioned vivid details. This comes from the principle of show, don't tell, which is all about speaking to the senses instead of the intellect. And that's the language of the mind. The mind only understands what the senses have experienced. And so if you can speak to the senses, it doesn't matter what language you speak, you can speak to people's minds. So storytelling is a universal language.
Emotion is the super glue of memory. I like that.
Yeah.
The other word you said a little while ago, Jamie, was action. And all of this is irrelevant without relevant action. We know if you don't do anything, nothing ever changes. And just to give you a little shout out to one of your other books, which is Overcome and Get It Done, which you wrote in 24 hours, and it's all about how you stop procrastination and how you just take action and do stuff. And one of the phrases you use in the book, which is something James trots out a lot as well, which is don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And that holds very true, doesn't it? Which is, we might not always take the right action with hindsight, but we can always adapt. We can do the Denning circle, plan, do, check, act. We can keep going in perpetual improvement. So a shout out to that book. It's a quick read. I would recommend anyone gets it. I think it's just a great story as well. The fact that you wrote it within 24 hours. Well, actually, you wrote it within about 12 hours, and it was out off the press within 24. So it's even more impressive. So well done on that. That was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. Technically, it was 15 hours, but yeah,
15 hours to write a book, and you got it done. And it had been on your to-do list for some time.
Yeah, well, I'd always wanted to write a book about productivity because I have so many ideas about it, but it was sparked by a friend kind of challenging me. My first book took me 6 years to write. And so he said, could you write a book faster? I said, all right, I'll write one in 24 hours. And it was a challenge. I wasn't sure if I could do it, but I remember when I was at university, everyone was doing their dissertations. technically you have a year to do your dissertation, but what really happens if everyone leaves it to the last day? And I remembered it's 10,000 words for a dissertation, and overcome and get it done is actually 10,000 words. So if a lazy student can write a dissertation in a day, I can write a book.
It's a great example of Parkinson's law, isn't it? Where a task takes as long as the time you allocate towards it. And often we've just got to cut that time down. We can still get, it may not be quite the same quality as if you spend 10 years on the job, etc. But you've got a product and it's done. You've got your book out, and we thoroughly enjoyed the book and recommend that.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think just one last thing to share about that. You mentioned perfectionism. I believe perfectionism is arrogance as well, because when you think something is not good enough, especially something that you are creating to share with the world, you are judging it by your standards. And it's not up to you to judge. It's up to the people that it's made for. And so when you hold yourself back and don't release something because I don't think it's good enough, that's actually being really arrogant. It's not up to you to judge. It's up to the other people to judge.
In which case, Mark is one of the least arrogant people I know.
Apart from the book I drafted, James, which is still at second draft stage.
You do have
like
a
3 years ago. So yeah.
Arrogance is
I'm very
is
arrogant
you
about
back
the
from
book
releasing
I'm
it.
penning. Yeah, absolutely.
So we always end, conscious of your time and being very generous with it, Jamie. We end with 2 stock questions on our interviews. First of which is are there sort of 3 books, podcasts, movies, whatever it might be, that you would recommend to the listeners?
One of my favorite books is The Patterning Instinct by Jeremy Lent. And many of your listeners have probably heard of Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens. The Patterning Instinct is a very similar book, but I think it's better than that, because it's all about, it starts with this core theory that we have this patterning instinct. And that's what led to the creation of language, which led to the creation of culture, and how our cultures were shaped over time. And so it's a very streamlined and a very, very objective look at history. More objective, I would say, than Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens. So that was a book that had a really strong influence on my thinking. I would say another book that that also had a big influence on my thinking was The Science of Storytelling by William Storr. Will Storr is a fantastic author. He recently published The Status Game as well, and several other books. And his books are all about psychology, but really powerful psychology that affects our everyday lives. The Science of Storytelling is all about the psychology, neuroscience of storytelling. And I found it really, really fascinating. And I think one other book which really blew my mind was How Emotions Are Made, or is it called How Emotions Work, by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And again, another book, it just completely blew my mind about emotions. We all have these traditional theories of different parts of the brain being different circuits for different emotions, and there's this anger circuit and so on, and every emotion comes from somewhere, but she presents a much more organic view of emotions. I just really, really recommend her book to really understand how emotions actually work. Yeah, so those would be my top 3 recommendations.
That's great, Jamie. You've actually given me 3 new books to read because I've not read any of those. So that's fantastic. Thank you.
So the very final question, Jamie, and then we'll leave you in peace for the day, is if you were able to transport yourself back in time to talk to an 18-year-old Jamie and impart some pearls of wisdom or some top tips for life, what would they be?
I think they would be to believe in yourself and accept your quirks a lot more, because you go through life when you're young, you tend not to have not everyone's like this, but I didn't have a lot of confidence when I was younger. I didn't fit in with so many people, and I just discovered that I have certain traits. We all have certain traits, and they can serve us really, really well if we let them, and if we put them in the right context, under the right conditions to flourish. And so don't think you have to be like everyone else. Accept who you are and allow your unique quirks to flourish. That is what I would say.
Do you think that now, with hindsight, China was the place that it was meant to be? That fit for you?
Absolutely, yeah. I really discovered myself in China, because I remember when I was in the UK, my biggest impression of growing up in the UK is the drinking culture in the UK, and people can be quite aggressive over there. Yeah. And I don't like drinking. I'm quite soft. I'm not aggressive in the slightest. And I came to China and I discovered they're quite introverted over here. And yeah, there's also a drinking culture, but there's also a lot of quiet culture as well. And there's a lot of opportunity over here. I think I've been very privileged to be in China at a time unlike no other in history. I think that time has passed as well. China's never going to be like that again, and I'm not sure if any other parts of the world will be like that again. But going through the fastest developing economy in history presented me with a lot of opportunities, and a lot of opportunities for growth in particular. So I'm very, very grateful for the time that I've spent here. Yeah.
Jamie, thank you on behalf of James and I for the time you spent with us today. We covered some topics which we didn't necessarily think we were going to at the start of the podcast, around the culture, doing business between China and the West. I think some of that is invaluable to our listeners who are either doing it now and not getting fulfilling relationships, or looking to do more of it in the future. That was before we even moved on to some of the training side, which you really specialize in, where again there's some top tips around behavioral changes with people. And if anyone wants to find out more, Jamie, how do they reach out to you?
Thank you. So you can find me on shapingpaths.com, all one word, my company website. You can also just look for Jamie Dixon on LinkedIn, and you will find my face with an orange background. So those will be the main places to find me.
Thank you, Jamie. It's been fascinating to hear your story and understand more about Chinese culture, your experiences, and the great value that you've been able to share on leadership. So thank you very much for joining us.
And we'll leave links in the show notes to contact details for Jamie. Jamie, thank you again. You've been incredibly generous. It was enlightening. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed it.
So, James, that brings us to the end of today's show. What a fascinating insight into life and business in China, and also how it interacts with the West as well, something we perhaps don't give enough consideration to. So thanks to Jamie for that. If you want to reach out to Jamie, then we'll leave links in the show notes. There'll also be links to the books that Jamie recommended, and we'll certainly be taking a look at those. As James said, 3 new ones on us, so that was great. Also, within our voice note section, if anyone would like to reach out, as James said, to talk about the culture in their country and how it impacts on business and leadership and life, we'd love to hear from you, so please reach out via the voice notes. And finally, a massive thank you to our sponsors, Larking and Gowen. Without them, this show wouldn't be possible. James, that just leaves us to say thank you to the listeners, and we'll see you all next week.
Great stuff. Thanks, Mark.